This is Ron Peters.
I'm John Nugent.
And I'm Sam Long.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the After Class Podcast. We're glad to have you along. We're recording this episode a few weeks ahead of time, but when this drops, we will be in hopefully sunny, beautiful San Diego at the Society of Biblical Literature Conference that we go to annually. It, of course, changes from place to place, but this year, sometimes it's Boston, sometimes it's San Diego, and this year is San Diego. Yeah. So we're very excited about getting out and getting there just to kind of get a break from the things that have been going on in a good way. Right.
San Diego is always really great because it is Southern California, and I don't think we've ever had bad weather. This will be our third time in San Diego.
Yep.
And I just can't remember ever having bad weather while we're there.
Yes, gorgeous. Someone told me the last time we were there, it's always like this, which was 55 to 80, and oh my gosh, this is amazing. And they said, it's always like this.
Yeah, it's not like living in Michigan where we literally have a 100-degree difference from our coldest to our hottest day. I mean, you think about January, February to August, and San Diego, it's about 10 degrees at daytime temperatures. So it's crazy. But it's going to be really good. This will be, for me and John, this will be our third time in San Diego.
That's right.
So it'll be the second time for you.
Yep.
And I think we've always had a good time when we were there.
The first one was good.
Yeah, we had a really good time. We had a really good meal. Back then, we actually had some after-class money, so we spent some after-class money on a really good meal.
So we were making money off of the satire? Was that?
Yeah.
Yes, back in the day.
It was satire money, exactly.
Biblically correct. We actually wrote a satire that was published in the Christian Standard, monthly magazine.
Yep.
Yeah, we did that for a while. That was kind of fun.
It was fun.
I feel like we did it for about a year, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Enough to have some money set aside to have a really good meal. Although that kind of created an expectation how we always want to have the good meal, but now we have to pony up a little bit more money out of our own pockets to make it happen.
Yeah. One year we went to the beach and looked at some seals on the water at La Jolla.
La Jolla, that was the first time. Because Heather was there for that.
That was a great.
Yeah, the stinky seals. Man, if you've never been around a large group of seals, they smell really strong. But that was a good trip. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to another trip to San Diego.
My most memorable experience in San Diego was the concert we crashed.
I was going to let you bring it up. I was thinking about it.
That was so much fun.
Oh, yeah, I totally understand. I was talking with my buddy Larry about it the other night, and we were talking about going back to San Diego, and he brought it up. It's like, I said, John will never have a better experience at SBL than crashing that concert.
It was so much fun. But anyway, not sure we have to recap that. We talked about it before.
Yeah.
If you're interested, you can tune into the After Class podcast, and we'll lay out all those details.
The After Class party, after party, whatever we want.
Yeah, that's not bad. The After Class party.
There you go.
Yeah, we should do that one of these days.
We have done it once. Remember, we did the live one down at the Brew, and that went really well. So we should try to figure out a way to do that again. That'd be fun.
We keep talking about doing an annual kind of reunion thing of getting people together, and then it just comes and goes.
Yeah. Life happens.
It's like we're busy, and that's low priority.
Right. Yeah.
Can't imagine that.
But we are starting a new series this week. That's probably going to go several weeks, and we've gotten really good feedback from our mini-series that walk through a Bible book. Mm-hmm. And we've done, Song of Songs. We've done James. What other books have we done?
That's
Those two.
Okay, well, we're ready to do a third.
Gonna keep this rolling.
And since the last one was in the New Testament, we thought we'd go Old Testament.
Oh, Old Testament. Never mind.
Well, we did do that, too.
We did do.
But not a walk through every verse, right?
Yeah.
Just an overview of all the Apocryphal books.
That would be kind of fun, though, if we could do something from the Apocrypha. Yeah, we'll just have to kind of put a little pin in that one to see if we want to come back to it.
But we deliberated and settled upon Micah. It's a prophet, only 7 chapters long.
Do you remember why we settled on Micah?
I know I said I like Micah.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I like them all, but I like Micah a lot.
I think lengthwise 7 chapters.
Yeah.
There's a quote messianic prophecy just in time for Christmas. Maybe we'll get to. I don't know.
Yeah, right around Christmas time.
Yeah.
So we love Micah.
Apparently, we all love Micah.
So today we'll begin by getting into some of the introductory issues, background about the book of Micah, just kind of
so I can just lean back and not talk.
Yeah, take a nap, man. It's fine.
Will do.
You may talk less during this time than you usually do, but you don't have to be 5 feet from the microphone.
But I like it back here.
He's leaned way
The
back.
chair leaned way back.
But I don't know. You want to take the lead with this, Sam?
Sure. Why don't we start with the name Micah, which is a Hebrew word. It's technically a couple of words put together. It means who is like Yahweh. So me, who, ka, or ki, like, and or Yah, it means is short for Yahweh. And it's an interesting name. Like, it's pretty cool. Who is like Yahweh? It's rhetorical. The answer is nobody. And so that's what his name means. And he was apparently from South Judea, about southwest, in a little town called Morsheth, which we don't really hear much about this city town or anywhere else, but it is close to Lachish, which comes up kind of importantly here in a little bit.
That's right.
And so he just, in the southern Judean sort of foothills, what they call the Shephelah, maybe a country boy of sorts, not quite like the Isaiahs of the world, were a little more court player. And he was a contemporary of Isaiah, right? He was around about the same time. They both prophesied in the southern part, Hosea and Amos in the northern, about the same time period, which we'll get to in a second. And I'm not sure what else to say about that.
So did Isaiah and Micah meet at a coffee shop and hang out?
Oh, definitely. They did not.
They don't talk about each other.
Yeah.
But they do have some overlapping material. It's like, wow, Micah and Isaiah say something strikingly similar here.
Yeah, and you wonder, did one copy the other? Or this kind of a phrase in the air that they both drew upon? Regardless, they clearly were contemporaries.
Yeah, and I like locating Micah. I mean, just kind of zoom out a little bit and locate this book canonically. This is obviously in the prophets section of the Hebrew Bible. It's a part of the minor prophets, right, or the Book of the 12,
right,
and it is located in the 8th century, and we have 4 prophets located in the 8th century. So Micah, Isaiah, Hosea, and Amos. And what's kind of neat about these 4, I mean, they're all in the same century, which means they all have a similar, roughly similar backdrop historically. You learn the 8th century history, and you have the background to all 4 books.
Right.
But it's kind of symmetrical. We have 2 prophets to the north, Amos and Hosea, 2 prophets to the south, Isaiah and Micah. And really, one of the prophets to the north was kind of like more city, central, connected, and one's more country. And the same thing with the southern kingdom. Isaiah is the connected one. He's got an audience with the king. He's a connected prophet, right? And then Micah's kind of the country guy. We don't really know much about him. And up north, it was Amos who's more of the outlier country guy, and Hosea was more mainstream at the center of things. And so there's a nice symmetry that I like that because it's easy for me to remember and categorize instead of having just 4 that are kind of randomly dispersed in this time period. No, we got 2 to the north, 2 to the south, 2 hillbillies, 2 city dwellers, and it's just kind of nice and symmetrical like that.
Yeah.
But and the name Micah, would you agree that Micah is short for Micaiah?
Yes.
It's a shortened version of Micaiah, and like you said, who is like Yah in the longer form, it's even more explicit. Micah, it's kind of who like but
who like a what?
With Micaiah,
yes,
the Yah brings out the divine name, short, the first half of Yahweh. So that's big picture of the prophets and the difference and where you can locate Micah in relation to the other 3 8th century prophets. And then them as a group you can separate from all the other prophets from different time periods.
And just to build a little bit on what you're talking about with Isaiah connected to the king, there's a reference in Jeremiah about Micah where the king, the king, he brought a message the king didn't like, but the king didn't kill him, right? And so he accepted and respected the message, though he didn't really like the message. And so that's interesting because you got to understand at this time and place there were probably a lot of prophets on the payroll, and they were happy to tell the king what the king wanted to hear. And you have at various times these different prophets who crop up, and they're like, no, that's not the way to go. And there's great stories with Ahab and the Syria for my war and other things. We're like, hey, let's talk to this guy about it because he never gives me anything good, right?
I hate him.
I hate him, but he won't lie to me, right? And so it seems like Micah was one of those guys who's he probably wasn't on the payroll. and I guess the king wanted an alternate perspective. He would call him up. But it's just kind of interesting that there are these guys who just seemingly yes men to the king, and Micah wasn't one of them.
And that's one of my favorite lines from the Old Testament. It's like when he says, which prophet was it when he said that about?
Mike, I think it was Micaiah. Not Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Keep
but
talking.
As soon as he says, let's go talk him, the king says that. He's just like, I hate him. It's like, such a great moment. It's like, it's just so terse. Because he never says anything good about me.
So,
one of those
that's a different
prophets.
Micaiah.
Yes.
Yeah, different Micaiah.
So, definitely the guy is named Micaiah, but it's a different one than that.
Yeah, and I know that I'm kind of going a little bit afield on, but it's a curiosity to me. I don't know if other people think about it. Like, is Micaiah, like for Micah, is that all he does is he's just a prophet? Or is he a guy who does other things and prophecy is kind of attached to it? Like, how would people understand day in and day out life for a guy like Micah?
Yeah, we don't have much on this guy.
Yeah,
that's fine.
That's a good question. Like a lot of them, we don't have it. I mean, you think about like John the Baptist in the same way. Like,
right? Yeah.
Did he have a day job, or is he just going around like eating locusts and crap? I mean, what's going on?
Yeah. Exactly.
Amos kind of stands out in that we have this kind of information about him, what he did during his day job.
Right. Yeah.
So.
That's why I was wondering if we knew, even could theorize, like what would be Micah's day job, or is prophesying just how he earns his living?
Well, I mean, he was a country guy, so could easily been some agrarian thing.
Yeah.
Like we talk about Amos being a dresser of figs and that sort of thing. So perhaps Micah had another tent making situation.
Right.
So, do you want to talk about the time, the 8th century, when things are going on? Because it's really important background to understanding not just Micah, but all of these prophets.
Hey, Sam, could you tell me what's going on in the 8th century so that I could understand Micah a little bit better? I'd really appreciate that.
Sure.
I do want to say one more thing about the name. Sorry. What's interesting about the name Micaiah, I mean, who is like Yah, is like in the last chapter of the book, the very final oracle, like verses 18 to 20 of chapter 7, begins with, who is a God like you? Like, so the message, of this oracle, like, talks about who is a God like you. Now, it's not who is a Yah like you, right? It is the word El, for God. But it makes you wonder whether, because his name kind of means who is like Yah, whether he kind of ended his book with a rhetorical flourish to say, who is a God like you? Like, a play on words with his name and introducing the rhetorical flourish at the end of the book.
Gotcha.
So anyway, incidental. Yeah. We may hit that when we wrap the book up, but I think it's worth, while we're talking about the name and what it means, it may actually feature in the oracles itself.
Pretty cool.
All right. So now back to the 8th century context.
Sure. So let's read verse 1, because that sets the king. So this is nice because it tells you exactly when this, well, at least when it's set, and we can talk about the authorship later, but it says, the word of Yahweh that came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of King Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Now, a lot of people, when they start names, they just like glaze over and skip over that, and like when we get the good stuff. But it's important to know when a prophet is prophesying, because it makes the message like come alive, understandable. And I ask this question when I start talking about prophets in my class, like how does a preacher's social situation dictate their message?
Yeah.
When you think about, like, what did 9/11 do for the next few weeks and months to preachers and what they were talking about? COVID, like all these things, like how does that shape their message? And in the same way, the events that were happening for all the prophets are going to shape what they're talking about. And so these specifically are these three kings mentioned, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. And they are southern kings. They are Judean kings. Jotham was what, 740s to
742 to 735.
Look at you, Johnny on the spot.
Got that right there.
I have notes. That's
You didn't pull that out of your memory.
Ahaz 735 to 715, and Hezekiah 715 to 687.
Right.
I mean, that's nice when you have three kings. That helps you be very precise, because it's during the entire reign of the middle king.
Right.
And probably the end of the first king and the beginning of the next king. Like, that helps us be super accurate and precise with their time period, especially because the first king we have reigned for 10 years, the second one for 20, and the last one for 30. And a prophetic ministry this says a lot about this prophetic ministry. It's at least 30 years long.
Right.
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Especially when the middle king was not great. And so, I mean, it means something, especially, again, he's not a court prophet. He's just some dude, seemingly. And so his ability to continue and proclaim a message of truth through that, in that length of time is impressive.
And it does distinguish him from Amos, like 2 years before the earthquake. Like it just pinpoints his prophecy to like, a year span. And so this guy is much different that he spans 3 kings, so probably at least 30 years.
Right.
And so during this time, it's important to know what's going on in world history. And we have the Assyrian Empire is on the move, and they are the world power, right? They are going and they are attacking anyone they can find. They're expanding their empire. So they are on the move, which is going to culminate at the end of the century. But kind of in the middle, there's a lull, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes scholars call it the Second Golden Age, where everyone's kind of, besides Israel and Judah, are kind of fighting each other or like leaving them alone, and they have this opportunity to just, be, right? They don't have to worry about the Egyptians attacking them or the Assyrians or the Mesopotamians or Hittites or the Philistines. Just kind of like, oh, they're all messing with each other. We're going to be quiet. Don't say anything. Don't see. Maybe they won't notice us, right?
Yeah.
And so they just have an opportunity to just be, to be and to ideally live out Torah. And so this is kind of the background to it of like, man, I wonder what that would look like. Of course, we don't know because they didn't. They had this great opportunity to live out Torah and be God's people, and they chose not to. Instead, you have a lot of injustices taking place. You have rich abusing the poor and all sorts of other things, a lot of syncretism. And so all that's taking place when in this great opportunity, they just squandered it.
Yeah, it's the only time in the Old Testament, this 8th century period, where Israel was mostly autonomous and had an opportunity to define themselves. Like just the outside pressures from the historical circumstances of what's going on in their own life and world, and the fact that the other nations are leaving them alone. Like you can define yourselves. You can be everything you want to be. There are no obstacles in your way. What will you do with this freedom and this opportunity? Which to me makes it one of the few centuries during the whole Bible period, right, Old and New Testament, where the identity of God's people is in their own hands, which is a lot like, I would say, the church in America today. There are few outside pressures that are keeping us from being the kind of church we believe God has called us to be. Mm-hmm. And so, the kind of things God says to his people when they have that kind of freedom back then are strikingly relevant to what he might say to us today.
Yeah, and that's such an important point I think a lot of like readers miss is they assume the Bible is like the context of the things that are going on were a lot like what's going on with them. But most of the Bible is written by an oppressed people, an enslaved people, an exiled people, not a people that are in power and have freedoms.
Yeah.
And so you're exactly right. These 4 prophets, especially, like we as the American church should read those 4 over and over again to see what God would say, because that's
canon within a canon,
right? Because that is our situation, and as opposed to we don't really get Revelation and Daniel. We don't get what it is to be oppressed and like worry about like if I don't offer the sacrifice, I'm going to be killed. And we don't know what that's like. And so we read them as though they're the same, and they're not. And contextually, like there's a lot of parallels between these 4 prophets, Micah included, and the American church.
Well, and maybe we didn't actually talk about this when we were trying to choose what we were going to talk about, but maybe there's something a little bit. We're talking about how Micah kind of speaks to the situations we find ourselves in as Americans. Like, maybe it's a good thing we're talking about this because it's going to be very relevant to our listeners, as opposed to some of the other books where it's like, that doesn't even apply to my situation. Why should I care? Yeah, maybe God was working inside of us to choose this, and we didn't even realize it because the message is going to be really relevant. Yeah.
Not that the other ones aren't.
I agree, but I'm saying very specifically relevant to our situation.
I mean, you make a valid point. If it doesn't, well, we're not going to that. Yeah. yes, Ron. Agreed. Let he who has an ear. So there are these. So this is just kind of just after that golden age, or maybe as it's winding down, and Assyria is beginning to rise in power, and they're beginning to be on the move. and so now the southern kingdom's going to have to figure out what they're going to do about that. And this is the same struggle that a lot of kings are going to have to encounter. I mean, you have a couple choices when an enemy is on your doorstep, right? Do you give in? Do you fight back? Do you find a treaty, another nation to fight back with against these people? Like there are different options, and kings are judged based on what their response is, and their faithfulness is a direct correlation to how they respond. And so we have 3 kings here, and what do you think, John? Out of the 3, how good are they?
How good are they?
Or not good are they?
Yeah.
I mean, Hezekiah is remembered as one of the most,
Correct. Yeah.
one of the few all-star kings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, where he loved the Lord, he prayed to the Lord, he relied upon the Lord against the Assyrian invasion. So, him and Josiah stand out among the most righteous. Ahaz and Jotham, not as much.
Yeah. Ahaz is pretty bad. Like, Jotham, I think, doesn't stand out for doing anything particularly great, but Ahaz, not a good dude. Like, child sacrifice. We should have a series about that. And so I mean, so it's going to give, I think, Micah a lot of fodder for talking about lots of different things between. A guy who's okay, a guy who's terrible, and then, like you said, Hezekiah, who, again, he chooses, if you know the story of Hezekiah, he chooses faith in God.
Yeah.
Like, he goes to Isaiah and, like, let's pray about this, and he's like, even though we have Assyrians surrounding us, we're going to trust in God rather than trusting in Egypt or somebody else.
Yeah. I'd like to highlight just 3 events that kind of surround his time period.
Yep.
So most scholars think that the range of this prophecy is between 730 to 700, and that's again the end of the first king and kind of halfway through the reign of Hezekiah. It's kind of a 30-year span. So right before this time, Tiglath-Pileser, the Assyrian king, waged a campaign against Aram, which is Syria to the north of Israel, Philistia to the west of Israel along the coast of the Mediterranean, and also parts of the northern kingdom were kind of hurt by that campaign, and parts of the southern kingdom were hurt by that campaign. So you just had, and so if you think about, where Micah is located, like if he looks to the north, Assyria is in control. If he looks to the west, Assyria is in control. If he looks down, there's not a whole lot.
It's true.
And if he looks to the east, then now you're talking Jerusalem area, which has really been untouched by the Assyrians up to this point. But definitely the threat is kind of starting to circle around, but isn't yet. And so they're still in a protective bubble.
It reminds me a little, because I think sometimes when we think of nations invading, we assume it's like the pictures you see of the graphics where like the red starts, the whole blob, and that's not really what it's like. It's more like, to be honest, kind of like the Ukraine-Russia invasion, where Russia will take a place or here and there, but it's not a blob. It's like scattered here and there parts where they've taken over, but they don't just take over the whole country as a uniform movement.
Yeah, and especially when you think of Judah and the southern kingdom, they're the stronghold in Palestine, would you say? At least for the southern half of Palestine?
Yeah, for sure, the southern. Lachish also. But
and so the way to take them is to kind of circle around, right? Is to go down along the coast through Philistine territory, then underneath Jerusalem, then up the eastern side of Jerusalem, right? So you're kind of circling around, and you're cutting them off from being able to go in any direction.
Right.
And then now that you've surrounded them pretty much on all sides, then you go after the big city, the most fortified city, which is Jerusalem. So yeah, they would circle around and then attack the middle, which is what the Assyrians do, and later what the Babylonians do. So at the beginning of Micah's time period, you have the beginning of the circling.
Yeah.
They're covered 2 out of 4 sides. And then in 722 is a big event. This is when the northern kingdom Hoshea, or King Hoshea, ends up being destroyed by the Assyrians.
Yeah.
Right. So the northern kingdom is completely demolished, and this would be during the time period of Micah.
Right, yeah.
So he's watched half of the people of God lose it. And so that's got to have a little existential crisis. Like 10 out of the 12 tribes are gone.
Yeah. They're dispersed. Other nations are brought in, and I mean he talks a little bit about Samaria and so forth, and he can then use I think that as an example for
Yes.
what you think they didn't survive. What makes you think you're going to, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so then, and the last key event, it kind of is at the end of his reign, not his reign, his time as prophet,
His reign as prophet.
would be when Sennacherib. So this time it's Sennacherib, the successor of Tiglath-Pileser, right? He assumes the throne and assumes all the territory that his predecessor did, and then he completes the circle, right? And then is making those inroads into Judah and attacking Jerusalem. That's when Hezekiah is king, and basically he's holed up in Jerusalem and he's about to lose it all. The southern kingdom is about to fall, just like the northern kingdom did 20 years earlier. And he's the one who calls out to God, and God sends a plague on Sennacherib's army, and Jerusalem is spared. But nonetheless, most of Judah is occupied territory. The Assyrians have taken control. So at the beginning of Micah's tenure as prophet, the threat has begun to circle. By the end of it, they're completely circled. But there's no evidence in Micah that Sennacherib has done this to Jerusalem yet.
Right.
So it's before Judah it seems to be fully under control. There doesn't seem to be a reference to this event such that we would think that he's probably done before this event.
Yeah. You think there is something either saying just give in or see I told you so or something, and you're right. There's no real reference to it other than it's on its way, and yeah.
So, anyway, so that's a little bit of the historical event.
Yeah, those three events are pretty important for the background for Micah and the other three prophets as well. All right,
dig into the text.
I would love that idea. We already read. I'll get there. We already read chapter 1, verse 1 that sets the stage for what's going on. Do you want to read 2 through 7 that kind of lays out, what the book kind of lays out I don't know what the book is about so much as where Micah's coming from.
Happy to do so. Hear you peoples, all of you. Listen, O earth, and all that is in it. And let the Lord God be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. For the Lord is coming out of his place, and will come down and tread upon the high places of the earth. Then the mountains will melt under him, and the valleys will burst open, like wax near the fire, like waters poured down a slope. All this is for the transgression of Jacob, and for the sins of the house of Israel. What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? And what is the high place of Judah? Is it not Jerusalem? Therefore I will make Samaria a heap in the open country, a place for planting vineyards. I will pour down her stones into the valley and uncover her foundations. All her images will be beaten to pieces. All her wages shall be burned with fire, and all her idols will be laid waste. As for the wages of a prostitute for the wages of a prostitute she gathered them, and as the wages of a prostitute they shall be used again.
That's a strong start.
Coming out with all guns blazing. Yeah.
Yeah, he doesn't work up to it.
No. Let's not ease into this prophecy. Let's just come out and lay it out there. But I mean, it is harsh. It's like this, I will pour down her stones into the valley and uncover, like just this idea of a city sliding into the valley, and then, obviously putting out the idols, but for as the wages of a prostitute, she gathered them, and as the wages of prostitution, like again, just harsh, hard language bringing out against these people. And so, and if we think of this as not just Micah, but God's assessment in his plans for this people, yeah, he's coming out and saying it's not going to go well for you.
This reminds me of Festivus and George's dad. I got a lot of problems with you people, right?
Yeah.
And he just starts out. I mean, because he says, "Here are you peoples," and this is he's bringing. The Hebrew is like a reeve, a lawsuit. We're going to see this used a couple times in Micah, but it starts out here, and he's calling witnesses. He's calling he's calling everyone together, saying, "All right, we gotta adjudicate this." Mm-hmm. And so he says, "Here, I got something I got to get off my chest," and it's for God. He's saying he's speaking to the place of God, like God's coming down, and he's not happy right? It's almost like your father's on his way home from work, and when he gets here, you're getting a spanking, and that's how he's going to begin the book.
Heard that before.
Oh, yeah, we've all been there, without a doubt.
Yeah, so I'm glad you pointed that out about hear you peoples, because that's kind of a prophetic oracle formula. A way of beginning a new oracle is hear or listen up.
Yeah.
Right. I'm bringing you a message, and that's important for the structure of the book, because that oracle formula of hear, we see that here in verse chapter 1-2. We see it again in chapter 3, verse 1, and then in chapter 6, verse 1. And so many scholars believe that the book should be divided into 3 sections according to the hear formula, right? And then each section would have 2 parts. It would begin with oracles of doom, and it would end with a reason for hope.
Right.
So this first one, like, it goes from 1-2 to 2:11, the doom section, and then the hope is like verses 12 and 13. So the hope is very, very small. The middle section, the doom is 12 verses, and the hope is like a chapter and a half. And so there's more hope in section 2, like at the center point of the book. And then in message 3, oracle 3, again, you have like a chapter and a half verse of doom and like maybe a half a chapter of hope. And so it ends on a more hope than the first oracle,
right?
But less hope than the second oracle. And I don't know if there's significance to that, but it does at least highlight the formula and the pattern we're going to see. Doom, hope, doom, hope, doom, hope, end of book. It's kind of a big picture of the structure. And this oracle is so key because it's setting the tone, not just for the first oracle, but I think for the whole book. And like, we sing a lot of songs about God, come fill this place, God be present, or Lord Jesus, can't wait till you come.
Yep.
This is an oracle about God's coming, right? And it's like, the Lord is coming, and you would think that people of God would be like, yay, he's going to vindicate his people, deliver his people, blessings on Jerusalem. But instead, it's the Lord is coming, and like mountains are melting, valleys are bursting like wax near fire, and all of this for the transgression of Jacob. And so he's coming, and it's not a joyous celebration.
Yeah, it's almost like we Michiganders know what it's like to get seasonal depression because we don't see the sun for 3 months, all right? And then we're so excited when spring comes and the sun comes out. But imagine if when spring came and the sun came out, it was going to be 150 degrees every day, right? And so we're really excited and like, oh crap, no, this isn't what we signed up for. We don't really actually want this because we're going to melt. And that's the imagery he uses. Things are just going to melt before like the glory of Yahweh that's going to be coming across the land.
Something that's significant about this oracle, and it does play into authorship theories and time period, and one of the theories about this book is there was like, version 1.0,
right,
and then version 2.0 later on, so that the book was kind of updated in light of later circumstances. Because when you look at this oracle, it seems like it's mostly about the northern kingdom. Right. Here he is in the southern kingdom. But it's for the transgression of Jacob, which is the northern kingdom, and the sins of the house of Israel. Again, that's usually northern kingdom language. Like when the kingdom is divided, Israel stands for the northern kingdom. But then you have this one phrase, the high place. Well, then you have the transgression of Jacob being Samaria, and the high place of Judah being Jerusalem. But that Judah-Jerusalem bit is like the only part about the southern kingdom.
Right.
And then but from 6 on, he's only talking about the northern kingdom, right? So therefore, I will make Samaria, like the judgment that's coming is upon Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom. There's nothing here about judgment upon Jerusalem, the high place of the southern kingdom. And so some scholars have suggested that the original form of this, when Micah first composed it, it was all about the northern kingdom. And then later on, when it looked like Judah was going to fall or was going to be attacked, then that one line about Jerusalem is added. And it could have been by Micah himself, like as 701 was approaching and Sennacherib was going after Jerusalem. Then it's just like, oh yeah, that message that applied to the northern kingdom, it now applies to us in the southern kingdom. I don't know if Sam, if you had any thoughts about that, or
okay. Authorship, updating, editing is always a controversial topic for certain people because I think they expect that it was written at one point at one time and locked away, and then eventually. And this doesn't seem to be how it worked. Like there seems to be a lot more that goes on with getting a final form of any book in the Bible, but especially the prophets, where you see they have different oracles that are brought together at different times. And Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if this was, he started out as a Southerner looking at, you guys are awful up there, right? You are terrible people and you've fallen away from God. And like you said, verse 5 sums it up. Like there's this syncretism going on where they're worshiping things they're not supposed to be worshiping. And he could look at them and say, you guys better be careful because God's going to come at you. I mean, they're their cousins, right? They're their family still, even though they're two separate nations. And he easily could have said, "Yeah, it's going to go badly for you," and then it does. And then he looks around and say, "Oh, well, guys, remember what I said to them? It's on its way here too." And so it would be not a big deal to throw in another, throw this in just to remind them, like, it's not just them, it's us as well. And so he kind of reappropriates his message to the north, to the south. And that makes perfect sense to me, but I understand how some people might not love that.
Yeah. And it's not a very biblical conviction to not love that.
Right.
Like one of the convictions of the book of Hebrews, that the word of God is living and active and sharper than a two-edged sword. That's after a whole section where, an original word, to the generation of Moses' time is applied and reappropriated toward the time of a psalmist who writes about, the wilderness wanderings. And that message is then applied to the period of the book of Hebrews. Like the message of God is alive for generation to generation to generation. So we believe God appropriates his earlier word for an earlier context and applies it to a later context. Why can't that happen inside of a book?
Right, yeah.
Like it's happening certainly spanning books, but it may be happening in the time of the author, so that instead of just getting God's initial word, we're getting God's initial word and his later word combined. Yeah. That would be a plus.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't at all take away from the power of God's word, just enhance its abiding relevance, because just like it was originally applied to the northern kingdom, it was then applied to the southern kingdom. It could later be applied to the church.
Yeah.
And we're a part of that tradition of ongoing application.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we're doing. And eventually we're going to talk a little bit about that here and there, is that Micah wasn't just a message for people who lived in the 8th century, that we still read it because we think God wants to communicate something to us from it. And so going back to what you said, John, it's part of the word being living and active. Even though it was spoken to people who lived in Israel, almost 3,000 years ago, it still has an application. And so why can't we see it as being this ongoing thing that God keeps bringing up to say, I know it applied to these people before, but guess what? Now it applies to you. And you just add like one line to make it more specific to the group of people you're talking to. And so I think it's a very good way of explaining that. And hopefully listeners who maybe at first are resistant to that idea will go, oh, actually, I think I've been doing that all along. Why should I be surprised that the biblical authors may have done the same thing?
I don't want to belabor the point, but I think if it were Micah doing it, people wouldn't have a problem. But when it's suggested that someone later added something in to Micah's words, then they get a little nervous, like, well, that person wasn't inspired, and so that's what I think they get a little nervous, saying, oh, so you're saying that like a bunch of hands touched this and brought it together? Like, how can I trust that? Right? And so it's a lot easier to trust that one person inspired by God did it all for some people than it is to say, well, God inspired multiple people to bring this to its final form.
Yeah,
right?
I think the key in what you just said is the assumption that, well, if it was someone later on, well, that person wasn't inspired. Oh, really?
Right.
How? What?
Why are we saying that?
Where did you come up with that? Like,
Yeah.
Why wouldn't the second person also be inspired as much as, like, if it's a part of God's inspired word and we look back on the entirety of Scripture and say it's God-breathed and useful for teaching, correcting, and rebuking, then the original could be God-breathed and the one who came later, which is what we do about, the book of Numbers, testimony about the wilderness generation, and then the later psalm that's written by it. It's written by a psalmist during the time of the monarchy. So that later person was inspired with a song, right, about the same event. Well, if that psalm was then inserted into the book of Numbers, right, would that make that psalm any less inspired if it was added at a later date? No. So it's basically, we already see this going on in Scripture, earlier versions and later versions, and they stand in different books. But some scholars have suggested that, well, some of this is happening and they stand within the same book.
Yeah.
And that doesn't at all mean the second one wasn't inspired, or that the bringing together of the first with the second was not, the process of stitching it together in its final form was itself also guided by God and therefore inspired. So there could be 3 layers of inspiration, right, that are coming, into play in the same book. So the
Yeah.
assumption that if a later person was involved, we've just lost inspiration, I would say, says who and on what, like divine authority? Is there another verse in the Bible that says a later version and updated must be not inspired, that I would never do something like that? No, we don't have a passage like that. So that's just a human idea, a human standard. Only the first person's allowed to be inspired, no second or third people. And just identifying that as a human conviction, not a biblical conviction.
No, it's a good point. I was going to say something, but you already kind of summed it up there. So I give my approval. Good job.
Well, I think there's some payoff here.
Yes.
Yeah.
That we lose. Like, if this was originally written to talk about the northern kingdom, then we have to ask the question, why is a southerner delivering an oracle either to the northern kingdom, or was he delivering an oracle about the northern kingdom to the southern kingdom? And I think if he was delivering an oracle to the southern kingdom, then part of that message would be to them, look, here's what God sees going on in the north, and he's going to judge them for their transgressions. And that might say something to someone in the southern kingdom that thinks it's a good idea to make an alliance with the northern kingdom so that together they might hold off the Assyrians, or a double alliance with them and Syria, right? But for a prophet to come and say, no, let me tell you what's going to happen to the north, and this is God's doing, that would send a message to a southerner, okay, so I'm going to stay out of that. And if that's God's judgment, I don't want to be allied with the northern kingdom when God's judging the northern kingdom, or else I'm going to get judged alongside him.
Right. You're not going to jump on a sinking ship, is what he's like. And so you're right. It's to assuage that idea, that temptation to do that, which is bad on its own, but especially bad when like this is terrible, right? This is the worst possible ally because they're going down, and you make a good point about that. And by the way, if we sound very passionate about this, it's because we've had run-ins about this sort of thing. And anyway, we're big fans of the Bible as inspired by God. We just don't think it has to happen a very specific way that some people do.
Yeah, a more robust view of what inspiration looks like.
Yeah, and frankly, I don't have a dog in the fight.
Me either.
On a personal level,
don't.
I think totally Micah could have written this whole thing.
Sure.
And this oracle could have been about both kingdoms. Great. There's an application there.
Yeah.
And so, to me, there's nothing at stake at that level. But I want our listeners to have, we've talked about the podcast as like some people like this is their grad school.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And we want people to understand that if you're going to read a commentary, you're going to read about different theories of authorship and composition and how the book came into being. And we just want you to understand that these arguments are not ridiculous that people come up with, that you should listen attentively to what they're saying and open to some of these theories having some merit and not automatically put up your defenses to protect the Bible. When you're not really protecting it from the scholar, you're protecting about, again, the human idea that only one person is allowed to be inspired to write one book. Like, you're protecting the Bible against a human idea that's not actually the one of the commentary that's giving you a hard time. So, my agenda, at least in bringing this up, is I want you to be more sympathetic when you're reading what scholars are saying.
Yeah, agree.
Why don't we finish our time talking about the actual problem that will be the rest of the book? And it's sort of alluded to in verse 5, the transgressions of Jacob, the sins of the house of Israel, the transgression and is Samaria, the high place, and so forth. But then in verse 7, he gets a little more specific, where he says, all her images shall be beaten to pieces, all her wages shall be burned with fire, all her idols I will lay waste, for the wages of a prostitute she gathered them, as the wages of a prostitute they shall again be used. And the issue of pretty much the entire Bible all the time is syncretism. It's a lack of allegiance. It's choosing multiple things instead of just the one thing. And so a lot of times I think it's framed where, those Israelites were just a bunch of idolaters who hated God. No, they seem to probably follow Yahweh on some level, but we're happy to bring in other things to make sure they were all covered, right? And so when they sacrifice to an idol or worship an idol or go to these other high places that are not affiliated with Yahweh, or if they were affiliated with Yahweh, there was some sort of a break off thing, and so this prophet and most of the prophets are going to have to say, you guys, in the same way that you refuse to allow God to fight for you, you refuse to worship God alone. So when you make alliances, you're not trusting in God. When you worship Baal or Asherah, you're not trusting in God. And so that's behind a lot of the prophets, and especially here, he mentions images and idols very specifically.
What do Samaria and Jerusalem have in common? So Samaria to the north and Jerusalem to the south?
So they're both the capital cities, and so that's where the locus of power is going to be for them. It was a worship center on some level, but it was not like Bethel and Dan, which we remember was a very specifically built to keep people from going to Jerusalem. And it was this, again, it's probably a worship of Yahweh, I would say, but a bastardized version.
Right, yeah,
it's not the pure version that it's supposed to be. And so I think Samaria stands for maybe the king, the political leaders, both how they rule, but also the religious area where like, hey, we're going to do this. So you have different prophets. So when you have Ahab and Jezebel, well, they're hanging out in Samaria with all their little prophets, right? And all things that go on with that. And so there's plenty of terrible things happening in Samaria that are not in line with what God wants.
Yeah. So the fact that they're political centers. I mean, Jerusalem is definitely political and cultic,
right?
And they've been merged together under David. Similar things are happening up north. So it's probably the idolatry and the prostitution is partly invoking other gods or invoking Yahweh as if he was one of those other gods.
Right.
And the kind of political idolatry of trusting in horses and chariots and alliances and other things of that nature, or relying upon your king as if he had godlike control of your destiny.
Yeah, and what he says is in the same way that like Jerusalem was as long as we have Jerusalem, we're okay. They may have felt similarly about Samaria, and what he says is, guess what's going to happen in Samaria? It's going to be a heap, right? It's not going to be this grand capital city anymore. It's going to be a place where you're going to have to just plant vineyards because there's nothing. It's not good for anything else. And so that's what he's going to have to deal with all throughout is who are they putting their trust in, what do their actions say, and it's going to be poor. He's going to have to call them out on many fronts.
All right, well, I think we're out of time for this episode, so we're going to wrap it up. Meantime, thank you so much for joining us in this episode of the After Class podcast. After Class because
the best conversations happen
after class.
Thank you again for listening to the After Class podcast. ACP is hosted by Sam Long, John Nugent, and Ron Peters. Audio production is provided by Drew Nyquist, and social media is managed by Darren Harris.